History Center. Our History Center is located at the corner of Station and Railroad Streets. We're open on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. And we have a lot of great artifacts, family files, got a lot of fun things. If you ever get a chance, and you should get a chance, please, come down and visit us. We are having a bake sale. It's going to be Thursday and Friday, May 7th and 8th. So I wanted to put some information on the table, and we'll be reminding you again at next month's program. We still have our calendars, they're $10. And again, you're thinking, oh, it's going to be April. However, the pictures are really the most valuable part of the calendar. This year we have all the old homes in Bridgeville. So even just to buy the calendars to have some memorabilia and some history on Bridgeville is a fun thing to do. Now we have refreshments for you, and one of the refreshments we do sell, it's an apricot pecan cake, and it's over on the table. Usually we have them around Christmas, but we're getting them for all year, and if you like a tasty treat, go ahead and try that. Okay, next month before I introduce Todd, we're going to have Ray from the fire department, our chief. He's going to talk about safety, about fire extinguishers, all kinds of things that you need to know, we should know, EMS information, just to keep ourselves safe and healthy. And then in May, we have John Euler, and it's going to be a little different. It's going to be about Brackenridge, but it's going to be a play. So we're all going to sit around in the round, and John's going to have a few people reading, and it's going to be like a play. So it'll be the story of Brackenridge, and that'll be fun. So we have merchandise for sale, we have goodies, please help yourself. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce Todd. He's going to tell you what he's been up to and do our presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for coming to hear about the Whiskey Rebellion. I'm Todd DePASTINO. I'm the director of the Veterans Breakfast Club. I do that full time now. We get veterans together to share their stories, in-person storytelling events, and also online, virtually twice a week. And we publish a quarterly magazine, and that's what I was shoving into your hands, whether you wanted it or not. That is our quarterly magazine. Our next one is going to the printer tomorrow, and that'll be our American 250 issue. What we do is we take the stories we hear at our events, and we share them in written form. And because I've been doing that with the Veterans Breakfast Club these past decade and a half, I haven't been teaching. I quit teaching. I used to teach college, and I wrote history, but I don't do books anymore. I like to get back to that, and I don't teach anymore. So I appreciate this opportunity to come and talk about history. Something I was trained in, something I keep up with, but not something I do for my job every day. And I used to teach the Whiskey Rebellion because it's such a compelling story, and it's a story that most students here in Western Pennsylvania, and most of you have heard of. The Whiskey Rebellion was a broad-based, low-simmering, long-simmering, and intense insurgency against the federal government that lasted from 1791 to 1794. It didn't just take place here. It took place everywhere west of the Appalachian Mountains. It took place in the Trans-Appalachian West, like you can see on this map. And it occurred, the Whiskey Rebellion occurred all throughout the West, from western New York all the way down to western Georgia, through western Virginia and Carolina. Western Pennsylvania was not the only place where it would happen, but it's here that the most dramatic events of the Whiskey Rebellion took place. And we call it the Whiskey Rebellion because that's what Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton called it. And he called it the Whiskey Rebellion in an attempt to minimize its significance. He meant it derisively. The Whiskey Rebellion was sparked by an excise tax on whiskey that the first U.S. Congress voted into law on March 3rd, 1791. But that was only the spark of the rebellion. The tinder, or the fuel that really that made the rebellion so big had been there a long time, since the end of the American Revolution. So the spark was the whiskey excise tax, but this was a region in crisis. It was a Western movement that was trying to eventually overthrow or secede from the federal government. And it also was a movement that was largely rich versus poor, although that's a little too crude, I think, as a characteristic, a little too crude a characterization of the rebellion. It was more accurately debtors versus creditors. And essentially this, virtually every farmer west of the Appalachian was in debt to merchants and bankers and financiers in the East. Simple as that. And that's largely because there was very little money circulating here. Money, currency. This is a perennial problem in American history right up to about the 20th century. And the problem was there just isn't enough of it. There isn't enough hard currency in circulation. And hard currency in 1791 was Bank of the United States banknotes and minted coinage, both created in Philadelphia. Rarely did they ever make it over the Allegheny Mountains here to western Pennsylvania. And you needed hard currency to do things like pay your taxes, to buy land, to make any big purchase. You needed hard currency that did not depreciate. If you wanted to buy livestock, you wanted to buy farm equipment, you needed hard currency. And so you really had to, if you lived in the West, in western Pennsylvania, you had to borrow it from somebody who had it. And the people who had it were the bankers and merchants in Philadelphia and New York and elsewhere. And they were happy to lend it to you for 10 or 12% interest. Robert Morris did a lot of loans here in the West. And the problem with loans like that is when you're a small farmer and you have a bad harvest and you can't pay back your loan, then that's when your property gets auctioned off. And this was endemic in the West in the years after the American Revolution. Bad harvests would put farmers out of business. If you're a farmer, the only thing worse than a bad harvest is a good harvest. Because then there's a bumper crop of grain, the price of grain goes down, and you can't make any money when you sell your grain on the market. I don't know why anybody ever becomes a farmer. But this was a very common disaster. It was common to be going down the road somewhere in western Pennsylvania and to see, happened all the time. You would see a family on the road, a farmer, a man and his wife and his children. Behind them would be the farm that was being auctioned, all the livestock being auctioned off, all the equipment being auctioned off, eventually the man, the farmer, being taken to debtor's prison. This was a common disaster. In fact, between the end of the American Revolution and the beginning of the Whiskey Rebellion, about 10 years, 1/3 of western Pennsylvania farmers lost their land. 1/3. All their land. This was a region in severe economic crisis. And it just seemed to be getting worse every single year. And one of the frustrating things about Pittsburghers, or western Pennsylvanians then, was that they saw this region as a region of great promise. And it was. I mean, here we are, right on the edge right in the headwaters of the Ohio. And as you know, the Ohio flows west. It hits the Mississippi River at Cairo, Illinois, which then the Mississippi goes all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And therefore, Pittsburghers ideally were in a great position to be able to sell their wares, sell their grain, sell whatever they wanted down the river, not only to lands out west, but also to the Caribbean, to Europe. Because once you get that grain to New Orleans, once you get the grain to the Gulf, it could go just about anywhere. And that was one of the great promises of western Pennsylvania, as was Ohio country right here in this royal blue. This was the Northwest Territory. It was part of the United States, and it was ours. We had won it in the American Revolution. This great stuff. But woe be to an American settler who moved west into Ohio country, because there were already people living there, and they were Native American. And they didn't like American settlers moving in to their land. And so they tended to kill American settlers who moved out west. So very few Pittsburghers made the further move down the Ohio or to access the land in Ohio country. And this was so frustrating Because not only was the federal government not doing anything to help, they were making the problem even worse. I mean, Pittsburghers could tell you, if we were sitting right now with somebody from where we live, where we're sitting, in 1791, they would come up with a very quick solution to a lot of these problems. Go to war against the Indians. Number one. Number two, get a treaty with the Spanish Empire. The Mississippi River is owned by the Spanish Empire, and they don't allow Americans to take goods down the Mississippi River and store them in warehouses in New Orleans. The Spanish Empire controls New Orleans, and they don't allow it because we don't have a treaty with them for that. Where's the treaty? And then this was the most galling thing for Western Pennsylvanians, who by and large very much supported the American Revolution, did not support the U.S. Constitution, but they did support the American Revolution. And they were galled by the fact that the American Indians in Ohio were being supplied, armed, trained, and funded by the British Empire. The British had agents who were training Indians to wage a guerrilla war against the Americans in the West. The British had promised to leave the United States. They had promised in the Treaty of Paris, which ended the American Revolution, to abandon their forts out west. They didn't do it. They were still there. And this was galling to those who lived in the West. This is a region in profound crisis, going downhill fast, with a brand new government in Philadelphia. Remember, this is 1791. The U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1789. So there's a new federal government headquartered in Philadelphia that seemed to be somehow abandoning or even conspiring against the peace and prosperity of the American West. And then came the whiskey excise tax. This was horrific to Americans living in this area. Excise taxes. Nobody likes them. They're like a tariff, but on domestic goods. It's a tax on commodities that are produced, distributed, or bought here domestically. They're very unpopular. They always have been. They're everywhere. Everywhere that they're imposed, and they are imposed just about everywhere. Very unpopular. Often, revolutions begin with the imposition of an excise tax. Because of that, excise taxes are very selective. We don't have that many of them. And they tend to be imposed on things that are bad for you. Sin tax. One of the first excise taxes after whiskey were on cigars, tobacco, right? Anything disgusting and bad gets an excise. Some of you might be old enough to remember that when you would go to the store and buy a pack of cards, there was a stamp over the closing of the cardboard box. That was a federal excise tax stamp, because gambling was bad for you if you're Presbyterian, right? It was a sin tax. Whiskey. This whiskey tax, the very first excise tax passed by the very first United States Congress in March of 1791. It's a pretty simple tax. It just says this: if you make whiskey, you will owe the federal government 9 cents a gallon. That's it. That's it. There was a loophole, which made the tax even worse. There was a loophole. If you were a large producer of whiskey, a large distiller, a commercial distillery, you could, instead of paying 9 cents a gallon, pay one flat rate. That would drop your tax about down to 5 or 6 cents a gallon. Quite a bargain. And this was clearly an effort to help the large distilleries compete against the small distillers, the ordinary farmers who were making and selling whiskey. Who was the largest whiskey distiller in the nation? The President of the United States, George Washington. And other people like him who had large distilleries were clearly going to benefit from this tax that was really going to put a lot of small producers out of business. That was the idea. How do you know? How does the federal government know how much whiskey you're making? You know? here to Bridgeville and, you know, monitor how much whiskey you're. What they do is they hire a revenue agent, a tax inspector, who makes the rounds, and he'll knock on your door, he'll ask to see your still, he'll look at your still, he'll measure it, he'll sniff around it, and then he'll come up with a figure of how many gallons this thing could make per year if it were operating year-round. And that would be the tax that you owe. Now, the revenue inspector had a big incentive to overestimate the amount of whiskey that you could make, because his revenue, his personal salary, was 1% of whatever he collected. So there was a built-in incentive to kind of overestimate. And also, you know, the farmers around here, they weren't making whiskey year-round. This was a seasonal thing. This was something that they would do in addition to all the other things that they were doing. These were not professional distilleries. These were distillers who were distilling on the side, kind of like what we would call a side hustle. The other thing that made this tax really galling to Pittsburghers was that it had to be paid in hard currency. It had to be paid in Bank of the United States banknotes or in minted coins. And so truly, Western farmers were in a position where they were going to have to maybe take out a loan to pay this tax. This was horrific for most Americans. Let me just say a few things about whiskey, because I love whiskey. And I do love rye whiskey, which is the kind of whiskey that was made here. It was called Monongahela Rye, and it was considered the best, by far, liquor in the country. Premier, highest quality. Monongahela Rye. It was made in western Pennsylvania, and everybody coveted it. Everybody drank whiskey. Everybody knew how to make it. The whiskey was better for you than the water. The water would kill you quickly. The whiskey would kill you over time. Whiskey was much better. And people drank whiskey like you wouldn't believe. Men, women, children drank it. And then there were the strange people who didn't drink any whiskey whatsoever. They were teetotalers. So, but if you take all Americans, and many historians have tried to do this calculation, because we all know as historians, as we look through the historic record, we all know and we all see very clearly that this country is drunk 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. I mean, we know that there's a lot of alcohol consumption in the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries. The best estimate is that the average American drank 3 shots of whiskey a day, 7 days a week. That includes babies, and that includes the elderly. So you take the whole population. So there's, the people who do drink are drinking more than 3 shots a day. Everybody knew how to make it. If you were 12 years old in Western Pennsylvania, you knew how to make whiskey. Whiskey is a drink that was created by the Scottish. The English drank it, and they drank gin. In New England, people drank cider. You know, John Adams would wake up and have a big tankard of cider first thing in the morning, his eye opener. George Washington drank rum, preferred rum. Jefferson preferred wine, but everybody else preferred whiskey. Everybody drank it. Everybody drank it all the time. And whiskey played such an important role in the economy here, because what farmers grew here was rye, grain. And that was great. The grain was fine. But how in the hell are you going to get that grain over the Appalachian Mountains to where the markets are in Philadelphia and Lancaster? Because remember, you can't sell west down the Ohio River. You've got to lug that grain over the mountains to Lancaster and to Philadelphia. How are you going to do it? It would be impossible. You wouldn't be able to take 1,200 pounds of grain and put it in wagons and on mules and horses and get it over the mountains and get it to market and sell it at a price that would compete with local rye. You just couldn't do it. So farmers did this. They took that 1,200 pounds of grain and they distilled it down to 160 pounds of whiskey. That's how you got the grain across the mountains. You pack them into casks, you put the casks on mules, and you send the mules over the mountains. And you sell it in Philadelphia. And again, the whiskey distilled here was coveted by drinkers across the country. So if you were to buy local whiskey produced in Philadelphia, you would pay probably 25 cents a gallon. But when the Monongahela Rye came, you'd pay $1 a gallon for it. This was how Pittsburghers and Western Pennsylvanians got their hands on hard currency. Everybody loved the whiskey. What made Monongahela Rye so great? Different historians, different writers will give you different reasons, whether it was the soil here or the water, the quality of the water here, and the techniques that the Scotch-Irish used here. I think it was almost certainly the fact that the whiskey was put into barrels made of oak and shaken up for 2 weeks on that long trek over the mountains, you know? Because when you drank the whiskey here, it was clear. But when they opened up the barrels in Philadelphia, it was brown. It had absorbed all those tannins and whatnot from the wood and kind of mellowed out the flavor and smoothed out the flavor. So whiskey was incredibly important. And because there was such a shortage of currency here, hard currency, there was no shortage of currency. There was a shortage of non-depreciating currency. Everybody had banknotes. Every company, every bank, churches could produce banknotes. Anybody could produce banknotes and trade them as currency. And if you trusted, let's say the Bridgeville Historical Society created its own currency, and you understood the finances of the Historical Society, you know that it's solid, it's been around a long time, it will be around time in the future, you would trade the Bridgeville Historical Society currency at a 1-to-1 ratio, 1-to-1 par around here. But let's say I went to Harrisburg and I had Bridgeville Historical Society currency in my pocket, and I go to a bar to buy a drink. Then look at that and say, where the heck's Bridgeville? Say, oh, well, it's in my town. They've never heard of it. They have no idea what it is. They'll say, we'll give you 2 pennies for it. You know, just in the off chance that it's actually good currency. That's how most currency worked around here. It depreciated. It was worth more the closer to where it was issued, and it decreased in value as you got farther and farther away from the place of issuance. Hard currency, currency that did not depreciate, very rare, very rare. You had to get it from the Bank of the United States in Philadelphia, or from minted coins, or you used whiskey. Whiskey functioned as currency here because it did not depreciate. It got better with age. You could easily measure it out. You could transport it fairly easily. It was not uncommon to hire a new minister for a church and pay him in whiskey because everybody knew its value and everybody traded it. Everybody needed it. So whiskey was essential to the economy here. And so when the whiskey excise tax was passed on March 3rd, 1791, Western Pennsylvanians did what they naturally should have done. They got together, met as a group of citizens, just like they had during the American Revolution when the Sons of Liberty would meet. And they decided as a group they weren't going to pay it. Simple as that. They weren't going to pay it, and nobody was going to pay it. And that they were going to patrol the region to make sure that any federal revenue collector never got to collect any revenue. This group that met, they called themselves the Mingo Creek Association because their headquarters was the Mingo Creek Presbyterian Church in Finleyville on Route 88. It's still there today, at least the same ground is there. There's the building today. This is what it looked like. Oh, you can see the building here. This is a Google Map image, Google Street View image. And you can see what the church looked then. This is where they met. They believed it was perfectly legal to nullify a federal law that they didn't agree with. Again, the Constitution was brand new. All these legal distinctions between state sovereignty and federal sovereignty, that hadn't been sorted out yet. They believed that they were completely in the right. They could just nullify any federal law that they didn't agree with. And they started patrol as a militia to make sure that the tax wasn't collected. One poor soul named Robert Johnson volunteered to become a revenue tax collector. He started making the rounds in Washington County. He's walking down, he's riding on his horse down Pigeon Creek, going to do some revenue inspecting of stills. And he's met on the trail by 16 men dressed as women who drag him off his horse, strip him of his clothes, tar and feather him, tie him to a tree, and take his horse. Robert Johnson frees himself. This is like September 1791. He frees himself and he goes to a local sheriff and he says, hey, these guys are dressed as women, but I know who they are. Put out arrest warrants for all of them for what they did to me. And a deputy is sent out to go get these men. And he's taken off his horse, he's stripped of his clothes, he's tied to a tree, he's tarred and feathered. So nobody ever volunteered to be a revenue tax collector. This was a very successful resistance movement. Not a dime of the whiskey excise tax was collected between 1791 and 1794 here. Not a dime. And it wasn't collected anywhere else in the West either. Because here and everywhere else, all the way from, again, Western New York to Western Georgia, there were these vigilante groups, like the Sons of Liberty during the American Revolution, patrolling to make sure that Philadelphia didn't impose its will on this area. And just like the Revolution, this was a two-pronged strategy that the whiskey rebels had. Just like during the American Revolution. You know, during the American Revolution, you had in Boston and in Philadelphia, you had the Sons of Liberty. These were the guys who put on disguises and beat people up and tarred and feathered and threw tea into the Boston Harbor and, you know, did kind of violence and mayhem. They were vigilantes. And they were working in conjunction with respectable people who would never be caught operating like that as vigilantes. You know, people who dressed nicely and who wrote letters to the king and wrote the Olive Branch Petition. They called themselves the Continental Congress. They did things the legal way, the right way. They did the petitioning. But you have to remember, these two prongs are of the same movement. The vigilantes give leverage to the petitioning channels. And the petitioning channels give legitimacy to the vigilantes. And that's exactly what happened here in Pittsburgh. You had the Mingo Creek Association doing the dirty work, and then you had the Pittsburgh Convention, and they styled themselves off the Continental Congress. You had the Pittsburgh Convention meeting, writing petitions, sending them to Congress, sending them to the President of the United States, asking for a repeal of the whiskey excise tax. And the leaders of the Pittsburgh Convention were three respectable people. They were William Finley, who was the first congressman from Western PA. His congressional district stretched from Erie to Maryland. He represented all of Western Pennsylvania, and he did for many years. He was a hardcore Jeffersonian on the radical end of the Jeffersonian movement. He was an anti-federalist. He wasn't really happy with the U.S. Constitution. Neither was his friend, Albert Gallatin, a really interesting man. He was an immigrant from Switzerland. He was elected to the U.S. Senate, and the U.S. Senate refused to seat him because he had not been naturalized as a citizen long enough, they judged. And he burned with resentment for that. He was also a Jeffersonian. And then you have this very interesting man that you're going to hear a lot more of next month from Joe and John, Hugh Henry Brackenridge. If you don't know Hugh Henry Breckinridge, don't blame yourself because he's not really well known, which is kind of amazing because he's the founder of the University of Pittsburgh. He's the founder of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. He was an attorney here, and according to Joe, he wrote, what, the first novel in the United States?
John.
Oh, so that's John.
He's the expert.
John is the expert, not
I've read
Joe.
a draft of his play. I guess you have too.
Yeah.
It's excellent. Make sure you come.
Yeah, it is excellent. I learned a lot from it.
But it's his project.
It's his project. You don't take any.
I commented.
Okay.
I contributed to it.
It's very wise of you not to take responsibility for your brother's behavior.
Little brother.
Yeah, Hugh Henry Brackenridge is an interesting guy. He supposedly wrote the first novel in the United States. I've not read it, but I've read of people who read it and say it's terrible. But it was the first, so there you go. And he was a moderate. He was an attorney. He started in Philadelphia and he moved to Pittsburgh to kind of, because he thought there was opportunity here. And the three of them were kind of savvy politicians. They wrote this petition to the U.S. Congress. They asked for Alexander Hamilton, the president, Congress to repeal the whiskey excise tax. They waited for several months, and then in the spring of 1792, they got their response, which was, no, we won't repeal it. We'll reduce it by 1%, but we won't appeal it. And just like during the American Revolution, this happens all the time. You have a group of moderates who try to seek a moderate, negotiated solution to a conflict. And when the moderates are slapped aside and rejected, the movement gets radical. Because the moderate option has been taken off the table and the radicals surface. That's what happened during the American Revolution. The First Continental Congress tried to settle the differences with King George III peacefully. King George III wouldn't even negotiate with them. Second Continental Congress, very radical. They want war. They go to war. They go to war, and then they eventually secede from the mother country. That's what happened here. That's what happened with the Whiskey Rebellion. The moderates were slapped aside, and a second Pittsburgh Convention was set up. It met at these meetings. One of the places where they met was at the sign of the Green Tree Tavern, which is where Fort Pitt Boulevard is today. It was a tavern is where they met. So the second Pittsburgh Convention meets, the moderates, the respectable moderates, are pushed aside, and the man who emerges as the radical leader is a guy named David Bradford. He's an attorney from Washington, PA, and he very quickly leads the movement to a place where they reject not only the excise tax, they reject all federal authority here in Western PA. They don't secede from the Union, but they say federal authority is null and void until we settle this matter. And so that meant they took over the courts, they took over the post office, they expanded their patrols to make sure that there were no federal authorities trying to collect any taxes whatsoever. They kept the army forts, there are two of them in town, one in Fort Pitt, one at Fort Fayette. They kept them alone for the time being. But otherwise, federal authority was null and void. The federal government ceased to operate here in Western PA. And they made, they made a few announcements. Number one, they said, nobody is permitted to even attempt to be a revenue collector, federal revenue collector here. Nobody is permitted to rent any office space to any branch of the federal government here. And no citizen is allowed to have a federal agent enter their property to assess their still. If you as a citizen agree to allow somebody to inspect your still, you will get a visit from Tom the Tinker. That's what they say. Tom the Tinker. Tom the Tinker is this. Tom the Tinker is like Robin Hood. He's everyone and no one. He's everywhere and nowhere. He's a mythical character, a legendary character. He's a nom de guerre. And a tinker is an itinerant repairman. So the joke was Tom the Tinker would come to your farm and fix your still by putting bullets in it and destroy your still. So it was clear, and it was enormously successful. I mean, these guys, the Mingo Creek Association, effectively controlled all the federal agencies here in Western PA for years. There was no federal authority in Western Pennsylvania. And there was no excise tax collected. And there was no conflict. Life just went on without the federal government. And that's how it would have gone if not for this guy. And this is a mystery that I can't quite explain. I hope your brother can. I think Brady Kreitzer, if you've ever seen him, a real wonderful expert historian on the Whiskey Rebellion, knows 100 times more than I do. And I do remember talking with him once and asking him, what the hell was with John Neville? I mean, what was his problem? Or if you go to Woodville, If you go and do the Presley Neville's, the tour of Presley Neville's house at Woodville, you can ask them. If you ask them, I've asked them, why would John Neville so insist on collecting the excise tax here in Western Pennsylvania? What was his problem? Was he cruising for a bruising? I mean, did he want to fight? What was the deal? And what they'll say is, and what Brady Kreischer will say is, he had an economic interest. John Neville was by far the richest man in Pittsburgh. He was probably the richest man west of the Appalachian Mountains anywhere in the United States. He was unbelievably wealthy. He controlled every economic sector in the region. His family controlled, all the pottery that was made here, the bricks that were made here. I think they had a glass operation going here. They were by far the biggest whiskey distiller here. So if the whiskey excise tax went into effect, the small distilleries would be put out of business and his monopoly would expand. That was the idea. But I think there was also something ideological going on with General John Neville. He was a Revolutionary War general. He was friends with George Washington. He knew Alexander Hamilton. He had moved, like Hugh Henry Brackenridge had, from the east to Pittsburgh for economic opportunity. And John Neville was a true believer in the United States Constitution. And this region had very few true believers in the Constitution. He supported federalism, he supported Hamilton, and he supported the excise tax on whiskey. John Neville lived like nobody else lived here. He had two mansions, one in Pittsburgh and one, as you know, on Bower Hill in Scott Township, right where Providence Point is today. This was a mansion by 1790s standards. It had plaster on the walls. Nobody had that. He had carpet on the floors. He had portraits and paintings on the walls. He had windows, very rare here in Pittsburgh. He had slaves. Not many slaves were in Pittsburgh, but he had 1,000 of them. And they worked a 10,000-acre farm, which was Bower Hill. And on May 31st, 1794, he put this notice in the newspaper. And the notice said, I am appointing myself the federal revenue collector for this region. And I will be visiting every farm, every homestead in the region, and my agents will be doing also, and we are determined to collect the tax. You are hereby forewarned. To help him do this, he asked Alexander Hamilton to send him a federal marshal. And a federal marshal arrived. His name was David Lennox. And in July 1794, they got on horses and they started to ride out in the countryside to issue subpoenas to prominent citizens who had not paid the tax over these previous 3 years. These subpoenas were, this was like kind of a warrant for arrest. Here is your fine. You owe a huge amount of money. If you want to contest it, you have to do it in Philadelphia. This was belligerent behavior. John Neville and David Lennox rode out and started delivering these subpoenas. They were called writs. And then on July 15th, 1794, they stopped at this house. This house is a recreation of the house that was there. It's called the Oliver Miller Homestead. It's in South Park. They recreate this event that I'm about to describe every July 15th. I highly recommend you go and watch it because it's hilarious. I mean, it's wonderful because it absolutely recreates the very best and most important parts of this confrontation. Here's what happens. John Neville and David Lennox arrive on horseback to William Miller's house, the Oliver Miller homestead. William Miller was Oliver Miller's son, and he lived in this house. They knock on the door. Somebody answers the door and says, well, William isn't here. He's out in the field. And they say, well, we're here to issue a subpoena or a writ for the excise tax. Out comes from the field William Miller, who walks up to the front porch and says something like, hi, John. They're friends. In fact, they're related by marriage. And John says, like, what are you doing here? And John Neville says, I'm here to issue a subpoena for your failure to pay the excise tax. And William Miller says, I can't repeat what William Miller says. He says, like, take that subpoena and, shove it, buddy. Like, what are you doing here? Like, why would you do this? Nobody's paying this tax. Nobody has paid this tax. This is a dead issue. What's your problem? And they get into this. In fact, I think William Miller eventually said something like, well, I'm moving to Kentucky. I had no plans to pay this. So they get into this big argument. And as they're arguing, and you'll see this on July 15th when you see the reenactment, it's great. They're cussing back and forth at each other. And then as they're cussing back and forth at each other, shots ring out. Shots are fired over the heads of John Neville and David Lennox. The shots come from a tree line over there. And David Lennox, this federal marshal from Philadelphia, very bravely, I think, steps up to the tree line and shouts into the tree line, "You cowards, you're hiding behind trees so we can't see your faces. Why don't you be men and show yourselves and we'll settle this like men." And so out steps the Mingo Creek boys. They step out, into the field and they start yelling at each other. And the Mingo Creek boys just are yelling and cursing and cussing at David Lennox. And David Lennox says something like, "Hold on, you're all talking at once, one at a time. What are you saying?" It points to one guy, and one guy says what he's saying. And David Lennox says, "I can't understand what you're saying." Ask another guy to say it. David Lennox would later write in his report, "The dialect of these people is so thick that you can't understand what they're saying." And this is the first instance of the Pittsburgh accent in American history. So great. Eventually, John Neville and David Lennox get chased off. They go back to Bower Hill, and the rebels decide to follow them. And they make it back to Bower Hill, the rebels do, by early in the morning of July 16th. And they surround the house, and they demand that they surrender Lennox, and they surrender the subpoenas. And Lennox isn't there, he's somewhere else. John Neville is there, though, with his wife and with his granddaughters, and I think a wife's friend, maybe. And John Neville leaps into action. And this is always often much lampooned in the history of the Whiskey Rebellion, and I think unfairly so. Because what happens is John Neville, this one man, alone, in a house with a bunch of women, scare off 50 tough rebels. And he does chase them off. But he chases them off because he's really good at what he does. Every single Pittsburgher knew how to defend their homesteads from a band of Indians who were laying siege to their house. I mean, families had drills to handle this. Little kids knew how to reload muskets, They immediately went into the drill mode. They took out all the muskets. Neville jumped from window to window, upstairs and downstairs, fired from different windows to confuse the rebels, to make them think there were more people inside than there were. And then, supposedly, there was some kind of white flag or handkerchief flown from a window, and Oliver Miller, the young Oliver Miller, who was William Miller's nephew, steps out into the open and gets killed. The rebels take his body and retreat. They meet at Couch's Fort. And Couch's Fort was an old fort, very small. It was meant simply to protect residents from Indian attacks. This is where residents would come and be safe when the Indians were on the rampage. It was old and decrepit by 1790s, but it was used as a meeting place. And it was located on Fort Couch Road. It was located, in fact, where the McDonald's is today, on Fort Couch Road. Some of you may be old enough to remember that at that location was the Pioneer Inn.
Yes.
I can't believe you're old enough to remember that, Rosemary. The Pioneer Inn was built on, the foundation of the Pioneer Inn was built on the foundation of the walls of the fort. That old big fireplace, I remember it from the 70s, I think, it was finally torn down. There was like a big fireplace. That was part of the fort's walls. But that's where the McDonald's is today. So these men meet, and they very quickly say, this is escalating. We need to respond. We need to demand John Neville's resignation. And we need to arrest David Lennox, who's operating here illegally. There's no federal authority allowed here. So they put out a quick call, and this is important. They put out a quick call. They need more militiamen to get this done. They put out a quick call, and they recruit 800 militiamen within the span of 12 hours. These militiamen return to Bower Hill the next day on July 17th. They arrive in the afternoon. They surround the house, and they demand that Neville surrender and Lennox surrender. Neville's not there. He had escaped down to Woodville. Lennox isn't there either. Abraham Kirkpatrick is there, who is the paymaster of Fort Pitt, and he's also the quartermaster at Fort Pitt. He's an Army captain. And he's also John Neville's brother-in-law. And he had Army soldiers with him, and there was a lot of firing back and forth. Once again, the story goes, is a handkerchief was flown out a window, like to surrender. And so the leader of the militia, a man named James McFarland Road, who was a Revolutionary War captain, he steps out from behind a tree to negotiate, and he's shot and killed from somebody in the house. And this is death number 2. This enrages the militia, and the militia burns the house to the ground and captures Kirkpatrick and eventually Lennox. They burn all of Bower Hill, all the outbuildings, everything but the slave quarters. And they burn the field, everything to the ground. 5 days later, the Mingo Creek Association has an emergency meeting at Mingo Creek Presbyterian Church where they make a decision, essentially, to secede from the Union. This is debated, and it should be debated because they never use the word secession. They don't use the word, break from the Union. They don't say that explicitly. What they say is we're going to seek protection from the Empire of Spain or the British Empire, and because we will no longer be a part of the federal authority in Philadelphia. So it's secession is the first step. And they also put out orders to contact rebels in New York and Virginia and Carolina. Will you join us in a new Western Confederation that was playfully termed West Sylvania? So this would be an independent country west of the Appalachian Mountains. And as David Bradford is kind of laying out this plan, Hugh Henry Brackenridge is there. And Brackenridge tells the crowd exactly what they don't want to hear. It's remarkable. It takes remarkable courage for him to do what he did. He stood up and said, what you're doing is seceding from the Union. That's illegal, and it's not allowed in the new U.S. Constitution. And they looked at him and like, what are you talking about? Like, we've read the Constitution, we think. The Constitution is brand new. And they said, that could not possibly be. We came into existence as a country based on the human right, the natural right of a people to secede from a government that they don't belong to anymore. Like, this is a fundamental right. There's no way that this Constitution disallows us to break away. And there's a debate about this. And Breckinridge is very insistent. He said, no, constitutionally, you don't have any legal ground. And David Bradford says this, who cares? Who cares? What's the federal government going to do about it? What are they going to do? Send the army? The army in 1791 consisted of 800 men. The rebels were able to raise 800 men in 12 hours. There was a time after the American Revolution where I think the army dropped to, 86 men? The United States Army was teeny tiny. No matter, even if the federal government insisted that they wanted to impose martial law here, they never could because they don't have enough army. And that's when Hugh Henry Brackenridge said, have you read the Militia Act that was passed in 1792? And of course, not one of the rebels had read it or heard of it. And Breckinridge said, I'll explain it to you. Every state in the Union has a militia, and a large one. Thousands of men who can be called up by their state governors. Well, the Militia Act in 1792 allows the President of the United States to federalize these state militias and make them effectively part of the United States Army. So, if President Washington wanted to do it, he could send easily 20,000 troops and declare martial law here in Western Pennsylvania. And there is evidence that that news shook David Bradford. But he didn't show the fear. And instead, he went ahead with his plan. And the plan was to snuff out the last bastion of federal support here in Western Pennsylvania, which was in the city of Pittsburgh. Allegheny County in 1794 had a population of 10,000 people. The city of Pittsburgh had a population of 1,000 people. And anybody who supported the federal government, and there weren't many around here, anybody who supported the federal government lived in Pittsburgh. Because Pittsburgh was where the courts were, it's where the post office was, it's where the forts were. And so people who lived in Pittsburgh did business with federal officials. They relied on federal money. And so they tended to support the federal government. It was a tiny population. You know, this is 5% maybe of the population of the region. But they're in Pittsburgh. And so the rebels decide, and David Bradford says, we have to capture Pittsburgh. And if Pittsburgh resists, we'll burn it to the ground. So the word was put out. If you're a militia anywhere in Allegheny County or in surrounding states, we want you to come and join us to take Pittsburgh as the first step towards this new nation that we're going to build, West Sylvania. They gather at Braddock's Field, which is where the old French and Indian War battle had been held, where the town of Braddock is today. They gather on August 1st on Braddock's Field. 3,000 men show up. This is remarkable. I mean, they show up from Western New York, they show up from Western Virginia. They want to be part of this movement. They show up with their weapons, they show up with 5 days worth of food, and they start to drill and march and, gather up into platoons and that kind of thing. David Bradford shows up. He has gone to a tailor and ordered a uniform, and he's now a general. He commissioned himself a general in this new army. He had a white hat with a plume in it and everything. He rode this white horse. And he, rode around kind of ginning up the crowd, like, we're going to go and, we're going to burn Pittsburgh to the ground if we have any resistance. Breckinridge was also circulating among the men, and he was trying to calm everything down. I think the people in Pittsburgh aren't that bad. I think they're on our side. And in fact, Breckinridge had, the days before, circulated in Pittsburgh. And he had said to the people there, get out of town. Lock your doors. Bury your valuables. And those of you who stay here, make sure that when the army arrives, you applaud them. And that you're there to feed them and to give them drink and pretend that you're on their side. Because that's the only way you'll be able to save your homes and your city. And so on August 1st, this big army begins to make its way down Braddock Field Road, 8 miles. You can imagine they're all stretched out a couple miles on a hot August day, marching right towards Pittsburgh. They march down Braddock Field Road here. Then they go down this street, which I think is First Avenue. I don't remember what this is. They go straight down this street towards Fort Pitt. But instead of going to Fort Pitt or turning right to go to Fort Fayette, they turn left on Market Street toward the Monongahela River. David Breckinridge ensured that they took that route. They were encouraged by the fact that there would be refreshments for them. It was a hot day, they were tired, they had just marched 9 miles to Pittsburgh. They turned left on Market Street, they turned left again on Water Street, and as they made their way back east on Water Street, they were led to an open field where the county jail is today. And in that open field were tables and tables and tables and benches filled with food and whiskey. These tired, hungry soldiers sat down and they started eating and drinking. Brackenridge made sure that there were boats right here along the shore, right next to where the picnic was, and that as the men, took a nap, they would be led to the boats and sailed across the river to the south side and dropped off there. The boats, the ferries, would drop them off and then return to the Pittsburgh side of the river to make sure that nobody came back. And by the next morning, most of the army was on the south side of the river, and the rest were nursing hangovers in this field where the jail is. And it was really this Brackenridge's effort to kind of, coax the army to accept the hospitality of Pittsburghers that really saved Pittsburgh that day. News, of course, of what had happened on July 14th at Bower Hill, news of this muster and march on Pittsburgh got back to the President of the United States in Philadelphia and to his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. And Hamilton convinced the President to march the Army, federalize militias in Maryland, Virginia, New Jersey, and the eastern part of Pennsylvania, federalize those, make them U.S. troops, and march them on Pittsburgh and declare martial law. George Washington, because he could never, ever refuse anything Alexander Hamilton ever suggested to him, agreed. They federalized about 20,000 troops. They put them on the march in two wings. One was led by George Washington himself, the northern wing. The southern wing came from Maryland and was led by Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee. These two wings met in McKeesport. By the time they met there were about 13,000 soldiers there. They marched into Pittsburgh, 13,000 soldiers. And once again, Allegheny County has a population of 10,000. Pittsburgh has a population of 1,000. Here comes 13,000 soldiers to declare martial law. They arrive in Pittsburgh in early November and they declare martial law. Hamilton rules Pittsburgh as a military governor. And his job, as he sees it, is to identify the rebels, the leaders of the rebels, arrest them, try them for treason, and hang them. That's what he wanted. The problem was most of the rebels, 2,000 of them, had fled. They had fled down the Ohio River. They had ended up settling in Kentucky and elsewhere. So there weren't, the leaders of the rebellion were gone for the most part. Still around were Albert Gallatin, Hugh Henry Brackenridge, William Finley, and Hamilton made sure he interviewed them. And the play that you're going to see here next month is this great interaction between Hamilton and Hugh Henry Brackenridge, because Hamilton desperately wanted to arrest Brackenridge for treason and hang him. But he could not get the evidence. So with deep frustration, Hamilton ordered a dragnet be sent out, and that 300 men in Pittsburgh be arrested and brought in. This happened on November 13th, 1794. Pittsburghers would remember it for generations as the dreadful night, because this was troops kicking in doors at 3 a.m., grabbing men out of their beds, wives and children screaming, dragging the men out of their houses, putting them in pigsties and in pens and in cellars and in jails, where they awaited trial, or they awaited a hearing before a judge. One by one, these 300 men were presented to a judge, a federal judge who was brought in from Philadelphia to kind of oversee the legal aspect of this case. All these men were arrested for treason. They were brought before Judge Peters. Judge Peters would nod to the federal attorney and say, "What is the charge against this man?" The attorney would say, "Treason, Your Honor." The judge would say, "What evidence do you have for the treason?" The attorney would say, "We have no evidence, Your Honor." And the judge would say, "You are free to go, sir." And that was it, man after man. There was no evidence against any of these people. They all got dismissed, one after the other, after the other, after the other. Hamilton pulls the judge aside and said, "What are you doing, buddy? I mean, we got to have some, I got to take bodies back to Philadelphia, you know? You pick 20. I don't care who they are." And so he did. He picked 20. 20 were selected. They were taken back to Philadelphia, marched across the Allegheny Mountains. They arrived in Philadelphia on Christmas Day. All of Philadelphia, it seems, 20,000 people, poured out to boo them when these 20 scraggly, downtrodden, raggedy Pittsburghers marched past the president's house in Philadelphia. Philadelphians booed them, and we've hated Philadelphia ever since. These men were brought before a grand jury. They were, 8 of them found there was no evidence against them. 12 of them were sent to trial. 10 of them were found not guilty. 2 of them were found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. John Mitchell and Philip Weigel. You'll know the name Weigel because Wiggle Whiskey is named after him. Wiggle Whiskey makes some of the best Monongahela rye you can buy today. I highly recommend it. And the logo of Wiggle Whiskey, you can see, is a noose that's fraying because Philip Weigel, while he was sentenced to death, he was pardoned by President Washington and allowed to return home. So he escaped the noose. And this is how the Whiskey Rebellion ends. It kind of ends with a whimper, you know, instead of a bang. But what you rarely hear about the Whiskey Rebellion after the dramatic events of the summer of 1794 is how quickly everything got better in Western Pennsylvania after the rebellion. It's like this. The whole region emerged from the crisis suddenly. And one of the reasons was because there were 13,000 federal troops occupying Pittsburgh for months under martial law, and they were being paid in hard currency. So suddenly this region was awash in non-depreciating currency, and that immediately lifted the region out of the doldrums. And then good news just kept coming. Mad Anthony Wayne, the general, he defeats a confederation of Indians at Toledo, Ohio, in the Battle of Fallen Timbers. That opens up Ohio territory for the first time. You didn't have to be afraid to take your goods down the Ohio River or to move west into Ohio country. The federal government in 1794, 1795, the next year, finally does negotiate a treaty with the Spanish Empire that allows Americans to take their goods down the Mississippi River and store them in warehouses in New Orleans, which opens up in whole new markets for this region. It's like it's a new birth for Pittsburgh. Prosperity is now on the horizon. And then the cherry on top was the 1800 election of the hero of every whiskey rebel, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was against the whiskey excise tax. He was the symbolic hero and kind of seen as the spiritual leader of the movement, and he gets elected president in 1800 with 100% of the popular vote in Allegheny County. 100%. And he had said, Jefferson was the one who said, the first error of the whiskey excise tax was to pass it, the second was to enforce it, and the third to make it a means for splitting this union. He repealed the tax. And so almost immediately, certainly by 1800, 1802, this whole region just rebounds and starts itself on the path to growth. John Neville, we don't have a portrait of him, this is all we have. He never rebuilt Bower Hill. Instead, but he didn't leave the region entirely. Instead, he bought an island in the Ohio River from the Indian scout Philip Montour, and he named the island. That's it. That's where he lived, and that's where he's buried, on Neville Island. David Bradford settled in Louisiana. He would be pardoned by President Jefferson. Hugh Henry Brackenridge ended up on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. William Finley would go on to serve in the Congress for many, many terms after 1794, and Albert Gallatin would get great revenge by being Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of the Treasury. And then James Madison's Secretary of the Treasury. He served 16 years as Secretary of the Treasury, longer than any Treasury Secretary in history. And if you go to Washington, D.C. now, and you go to the Department of Treasury, and you stand in front of the Department of Treasury, you see a big statue of Albert Gallatin. Hamilton has a statue also, in the rear, that's only visible from the parking lot, which is closed to the public. So that's the story of the Whiskey Rebellion. Thank you very much.